By the way, in Britain, if you introduce somebody as an intellectual, it's death. Nothing that kills something more.
I have no fear of being introduced like that anywhere.
Yeah, no, I am concerned about labels these days because we were talking before about the nature of the internet and that nobody expected it to go this way of like unbelievable vitriol and rage and sort of grasping for short-term explanations for people. And yeah, political labels and indeed some religious labels become really unhelpful because they become a sort of way to not listen to somebody in advance. You know, some of it can be useful, obviously, but by this stage, I kind of feel most political labels are a real problem.
I wonder how much of it is maybe. I don't necessarily want to label people as excessively lazy or frustrated, but I think that has to be a part of it where everything is a label. Every word we use is a label for some concept, and so we use this to communicate, and we're generally pretty good at it in the sense that we're not falling apart at the roots of civilization. We're able to, you understand me, I understand you, even though I don't have that particular accent. We've sorted it out a little bit. But when we talk about the labels that we put on broader concepts, what I find happens quite often is they're either used as a way to dismiss without any actual substantive conversation, or they're used as a shorthand where you just assume the people you're talking to have the same understanding of the label that you do.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case.
No, and I don't want to labor the point, but transatlantic, it's not a consistent language about politics. Where I'm from, liberal means something different from what it means here, for instance. And there's all sorts of words like that don't travel. But no, I mean, I think that generally the problem of labels has been accentuated by social media, which has all sorts of advantages, has some serious drawbacks. And the main drawback, I mentioned this to Matt earlier, is that people who do the sort of things we do used to craft what we said and what we wrote in order to make sure, among other things, that an honest critic couldn't misunderstand us. And the strange thing about the era of social media and the internet is that you end up having to craft what you say and write in order to try to make sure that a dishonest critic also can't misrepresent you. It's an almost impossible task, but one we're obviously trying to find our way through.
It's when it comes to the sorting out which are the honest critics and which are the dishonest critics, I find that's actually getting more difficult as well, because while I pretend to read minds on stage, I can't actually read minds, and so if somebody comes after something I've said on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I have to spend a great deal of time before I even decide if I'm going to respond or how I'm going to respond. Is this individual confused? Have I not crafted my message clearly enough? Or is there some way I could reword the message to rehabilitate this individual? Or are they one of the dishonest ones, the people who are sometimes labeled the outrage brigade by my friend Seth? They're just never going to be happy no matter what you say, because you didn't say it exactly the way they wanted to in the time frame they wanted.
Yeah, what I get is you didn't say it all in the 60 seconds we gave you, which, if you're dealing with the meaning of life or something, it's often hard to hit that moment.
Yes, it's in the debates that I've often had with religious apologists. There's something called the Gish Gallop, which is named after Duane Gish, where the apologist will present 20 things that are wrong,
right?
Each of which would take you an hour to 10 hours to properly rebut. Yes. And then whichever ones you don't address, when it's their turn to speak next, they'll say, my opponent failed to address points 3, 4, 7, and therefore I win.
Yeah. Well, the Times of London the other day reported on this Flat Earth Society that's now booming, at least booming to the extent that Flat Earth Societies can for the time being. But I mean, they had I don't know, they had a conference the other day in London, and they got like 300 flat earthers who all had these points about like the horizon. No one had actually been to it. How do you know? And there was some amazing. Then they had T-shirts and things. You know, they obviously want people to know they're flat earthers. And how dim they are. But we weren't expecting that. We weren't expecting the Flat Earth Society to get a boom in the foreseeable future, and yet there they are.
I can remember years ago, and I don't know how many people here have watched a lot of episodes of The Atheist Experience, but there was an episode where I basically said, well, nobody believes in the Greek gods anymore. And that was a mistake because the emails came in. It didn't come pouring in, they trickled in, but it was still...
What did they say?
They said, oh, you're wrong. I actually still do believe in the Greek gods. And I was like, oh, that's a good joke. And then they were clearly offended and outraged that I would dismiss this as a joke. And so I had a brief conversation with one of them, and it's not worth repeating. But to be fair, it encouraged me to exercise more caution in making, grandiose claims of nobody believes this anymore. Oh, somebody does.
You sort of hope that they're in a terrible internecine war with people who still worship the Roman gods. They just go at it late at night.
Yes. I've done much the same thing with Christian apologists on occasion. There was an event where I had done a video about slavery, and every Christian apologist has a different pathway to try to rehabilitate the Bible's position on slavery. And so I was standing there with 4 of them, and they were all trying to rehabilitate this in a different way.
Right.
And so it was perfect because I just said, you 4 sort it out. When you figure out what the right answer is from God, come back and I'll address that one. Because until you do, I don't see any reason to address 4 different answers from God. Why hasn't he cleared this up already?
Yeah. Were there any plausible arguments from them?
I don't know. I never heard back from them after they... I suspect that there was not agreement.
At least they'd all agreed it was bad. And they were trying
You would hope so, but you would be mistaken.
Really?
Because there are people who go down that road that say that once upon a time it was perfectly moral and acceptable. And also that because ultimately it was in the benefit of those who were enslaved because they now had access to the true religion that they didn't have access to before.
Right. God, it's a hell of a way to get it, isn't it? It's the worst route there.
Yeah, salvation at gunpoint, I guess, kind of. There's one question that I was asked to ask you, so I might get that out of the way because it might tie into a few things. An internet friend of mine wanted me to ask why you encouraged atheists in Great Britain to go to church last Christmas.
Good question. We go straight into the deeps. Well, obviously Britain, where I'm from, and Europe more generally, the situation with religion is different from the situation you have here. I mean, there are all sorts of differences, all sorts of similarities, but we don't have in Britain a kind of any form of strong Christianity that I see as being any threat in the public sphere. I mean, our bishops are all basically on the verge of atheism, as far as I can see. If you get a bishop in Britain, I mean, the hardest thing to do for them is to affirm what was their creed. It's filled with sort of God, as it were. So we have the sort of doubting bishop as a sort of perpetual part of the comedy of British life. And so we don't have that assertive form of religion which can still exist here, and in certain states is very strong. And I think it's partly, I write a bit about this quite a bit in this recent book. I think that we are in a very strange place in Europe, in Britain, in our relation to faith. And for all sorts of reasons, of which we can get into, we are in this situation that a wonderful French philosopher called Chantal del Sol described as being in the situation that Icarus would have been in if he'd survived the fall. That is that by the time that the Cold War finishes in Europe, we've dreamed all of these religious dreams and they've all crashed. We've dreamed all of these political dreams, including 2 big ones in the 20th century that turned out to be global nightmares. So that by the time the last of those falls, we are on the ground, wounded, burnt, singed, badly bruised, and rather amazed to find that we're still here with this big question that then comes up, which is, what do we do? And again, I mean, this doesn't apply in quite the same way in this country as I see it.
Which I think may be one of the reasons why this kind of question goes up, but I want to let you get through it.
But I suppose one of the things I feel, and I know a lot of people now in Europe from the political left, right, center ground, atheists, non-atheists, and so on, who are starting to worry. And I suppose the worry, for me, condenses into this, which is the increasing fear that the Enlightenment didn't go very deep or very wide or very far, and that it turns out not to be cherished by all that many people, and that what might come down the road might be so much worse. I put it no stronger for now than the nervousness. And since this is a situation we're in, I mean, I'm an atheist, I have been for many years. I don't believe in the little claims of the Bible or anything else. But I do recognize something which in Europe, at any rate, I see and I'm concerned about, which is what I regard as a vacuum. And one of the only interim answers I've been able to put forward is to say, we can accept the fact that we're atheists, we can accept the fact that we don't believe in literal truth and so on, and yet have to find a way to remind ourselves and each other of how we got to where we are. Because there's a whole set of things which I and others start to worry about. And one of the few ways I've found to try to explain this is to say that includes in engaging in parts of your past which you no longer believe in, at the very least to know how you got to where you are now. So I didn't say in that piece that people should go to church and praise the risen Lord, but to say to them, at least engage in the thing that got you to the place you are now, and know how it happened. Let me put it another way very quickly. One of the most striking things, there's a British rabbi called Jonathan Sacks, who has some position here in New York as well. Some years ago I said to him, a slightly impertinent question, but I said, Rabbi Sacks, I know quite a lot of your congregation in London, and how can I put this, but they all seem to be atheists, or at least a lot of them. And without missing a beat, he said, oh, most of them, I'd have thought. And I said, and you could see I was sort of slightly thrown, and I said, well, what do you take from that? And he replied rabbinically with a non-answer. He said, this year 98% of British Jews will be celebrating the holidays. And this is just an interesting way through a bit of this, it seems to me. Accepting the realities of where we are, but not casting people into, particularly the people you and I both know and have come across, who find the position, once they arrive there, of atheism to be a very lonely place. And I just, as I say, it's not an answer to the whole thing, but as an interim thing, to say at least remain engaged in all of this idea and all of this past. Engage with it.
I think I might understand what some of the confusion and concern is, and I suspected some of this is differences on either side of the pond. And for me, not having grown up in Britain, suffocated by Church of England, and its largely atheistic irrelevancy, I find it strange that you're talking to a rabbi who says that 98% of Jews are going to be celebrating the holidays. I'm assuming he's talking about Christmas.
Oh, no, he's talking about the Jewish holidays.
He's talking about the Jewish holidays. And yet, we know that, I think studies have shown that 50% of Jews in Israel are secular.
Sure.
And Reform Judaism doesn't require any belief in a God. So
sure.
we often make a mistake of talking about religion as if it's one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's absolutely false, because Judaism, even in its varieties, is already very different. The Reform Judaism doesn't require a belief in a God, and so you get a rabbi that's not surprised that his congregation is largely atheist, and then you get conservative and Hasidic Jews that I doubt very many of those are atheists, and then you have the various varieties of Christianity. And one of the questions that's come up quite often is, why is the view of religion in the UK so much different from the way it is in the States? And I've often heard it put forward that this is an issue of a free market, where in the UK, because you have a state religion, there was no competition to draw people in. And the United States, we had freedom of religion, and so they're in competition to market.
Yes, I mean, let me give an example of that. Everybody in the UK lives technically in a parish, and that means that the priest in that parish could, even if you were a non-believer, be responsible for your spiritual well-being, for your funeral, for instance. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everyone automatically gets a Church of England funeral, but it means that the default position is that the state church would be there. Whereas I think if you were a Catholic, for instance, if you were an atheist and you died, your local Catholic church would not stake any claim for your religious rights. So there is yes, it has done something strange like that. The other thing is just that, who knows, it's just a lot more advanced in Europe, for good and ill, but that they say that, well, the southern Mediterranean states, Italy, Catholic Church is very strong still, Spain, very strong. So, you have to draw up these distinctions within it. But basically in the Protestant parts of Europe, there's very little. They some time ago, I think, became basically the Green Party at prayer. They explain how important it is to tackle global warming and so on, which is all good, but it's not saying to people, you have to affirm the creed, otherwise you're going to hell.
I heard good things about Spain in the last few years, pulling away from the church and instituting a far more secular government, to the point where I joked that if my country became a theocracy, I'd go to Spain, because at least I had 2 years of high school Spanish, which sets me up better.
The country that is most striking in is Ireland. I first went to Ireland, I did my first book in the late 90s, 2000. And then Ireland was still a very, very, it's the most oppressively religious country in Europe I'd been to. The Catholic Church had such a grip. Today, I don't think you could find a more secular country. It's really fascinating, and it's one thing in particular, which is a clerical abuse scandal, which has just turned the Irish people, understandably, against the whole thing. And, to the extent that a bishop now stands up and makes a moral pronouncement, and the Irish public want to do the opposite. In fact, the Catholic Church, I can't remember what was in the abortion debate or the gay marriage. Yes, they sat out the gay marriage debate, basically, because they knew that if they came out against, the public vote in the referendum would be even bigger for gay marriage.
And the scandals, they go deep there. They're not just dealing with pederasts and child rapists. This was theft of children from unwed mothers and workhouses and just...
and in living memory.
Yeah.
No, it's an extraordinary thing, but to see a society shift that fast in 18 years or so is a remarkable thing.
Which kind of sticks a pin in what everybody who knows me knows I've been waiting to object to. If the fear is we're losing something, so as a stopgap measure, go back to what got you here. I might have a slight issue with going back to what got us here if the place we are is that we're bleeding and bloody on the ground after the fall. But one of the things that the secular community in the United States has been doing, for the longest time, atheism in the United States was a bunch of guys that looked like me complaining about how much religion sucked and congratulating themselves for getting the right answer to what I think is literally the easiest question: do I have enough reason to believe this? But as we move forward, and the percentage of the population that identify as nones, the NONEs, no religious preference and no religious identity, we've started to do things like, well, actually Sunday Assembly, I think, started in Britain, but it's here as well, an Oasis, and we're building landing places that are founded on principles of secular humanism, which can serve as one potential moral and virtue guiding principle, but also create places for people to land when they find their way out of religion.
Sure.
And I'm happy to tell people, I go to church not for the reasons that you're suggesting. But I go to church more often than people would guess, because on the TV show, I want to make sure that I am not strawmanning religious views.
Do you ever get surprised when you do that?
Not anymore.
No.
There's been a massive change from when I was younger. I mean, I went to a Southern Baptist church primarily. I would occasionally go to Pentecostal churches because they had better concerts. And they would have the Christian rock bands of Petra and Carmen and stuff, and they'd all come to those churches. So I liked those.
The very words Christian rock band just make me kind of come goose pimply.
I feel the same way when I hear Christian magician, but that's another story. But growing up in those kinds of churches, I want to make sure that I'm not only relying on the version of Christianity that I grew up with, and that I'm not relying on something from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I will go to some of the churches. The mega churches, even most of the people I grew up with who were religious would look at most of the modern mega churches and say, well, that's not Christianity.
Right.
Now, I don't get to say what is or isn't Christianity. That's for them to decide. But it is very much, you don't get dressed up in your Sunday best anymore. You go in jeans and a t-shirt, and you're singing rock songs that have been perhaps mildly converted to be a little bit more about a God. That some atheist on LSD wrote this song for the secular world, and the church has managed to co-opt it, and they've co-opted the slogans from everything. You'll have T-shirts of the McDonald's shirts, and they'll twist the McDonald's logo to be about Jesus and all this stuff.
How do they do that?
It is.
What?
So Seth Andrews, everybody loves Seth? Yeah. Yes. He hosts the Thinking Atheist podcast. He has a video up specifically going through the various things that Christian organizations steal. They twist it around.
How do they get Jesus out of McDonald's?
Does anybody remember the specific one from McDonald's? I don't know, but there was
Wow.
They take Mountain Dew logos, everything, and just turn it into this. It is very much a marketing thing, and I don't want to ever say that somebody's being disingenuous about their beliefs.
Sure.
But when we talk about, hey, maybe we've lost something, I don't think that I could ever send people to church for that reason, and it may just be a difference in the type of church that we're talking about.
Yeah, it may be. I mean, as I said, I don't want to overemphasize it, but I mean, there are tiny pockets where what I'm saying is not the case. The island in the Outer Hebrides that my father comes from, there are about 30 different sects of Presbyterianism, within about a square mile of each other, and they're a bit watered down, but not that much. But otherwise, you as I say, it's fascinating to me because I've been doing this for 20 years or so, and I've just noticed that the entire discussion on ethics, for instance, if you go to the BBC or something and you have a discussion on ethics, 15 years ago, you'd always have a bishop, purple robe, big cross, and so on. And now they just don't go for those guys. And when they do, those guys don't have much to add, it seems. I mean, you can, regret or otherwise, I don't particularly, but you can see they just don't know how to find a way into the discussions we're now having.
And this is something I've actually been kind of standing in opposition to here, because you'll watch the news and there will be some member of the clergy on to comment on seemingly everything. I'm exaggerating slightly, but there'll be a political discussion and you'll have to get the minister's view of it. And it happens in the local communities as well as the national news. I remember a CNN brief piece, but it stuck in my mind forever because the banner behind them was, "Why do atheists inspire such hatred?" Of course, I immediately point out the question is flawed because it presumes that we're the ones inspiring this, rather than why is hatred directed at atheists? Because then it could be our fault or their fault or a combination. So asking the wrong questions is probably one of the biggest problems in the world right now. But they had a panel on to discuss it. How many atheists were on that panel? None.
Really?
Not one. 2 Christians and a Jew to explain to the world that atheists were just really bad at PR, and that we didn't have any morals to live by.
My sense is, by the way, and again, I mean this is a positive, my sense even in this country is that a lot of the religious leaders they don't quite want to tell you what they really believe, which is a step in the right direction. And my impression still is that most of them know that the culture has shifted or is shifting significantly enough that they know that some of the things they might believe or might have claimed 20 years ago have become total landmines for them.
So here's what we'll do. You come down to Austin, we'll take a drive to San Antonio, and you can listen to John Hagee, who runs one of the biggest churches in the United States, talk about how nasty atheists are, and if they don't like God's country, they can get out of the United States, boy.
He must be about the only one who hasn't been caught with a rent boy. Haven't they all, almost all? And I notice any, and late friend Christopher Hitchens used to have a great riff on this, that you know, whenever you saw any of them holding forth on moral issues, you just make a note, and before you knew it, you'd find they'd maxed out the credit card trying to pay some rent boy,
The scandals are
almost consistent rule.
This,
So I'm
this
amazed
actually-
Hagee, I don't know what the laws of defamation are like in this country, but I'm amazed
No, you're
Hagee
fine.
is already not.
Yeah, well, and he's just one of many examples. There's some that are, and this is another problem with the internet. There's a pastor, I'm not even going to bother saying his name, because he's already gotten too much publicity. Tiny, tiny church, and yet broadcasts over the internet, which gets him all kind of attention, mostly from atheists who want to just say, "Oh my gosh, this guy is terrible." I don't know what percentage of church-going Christians actually care what this guy says, but he's awful with regard to women and everything else. But when we, clearly there's going to be differences. I wonder if how much of the differences that we're seeing are actually related to differences in culture. Because I have some rather troubling questions related to culture. And as you've spoken a lot about issues related to multiculturalism, I figured maybe we could address some of that, because
Sure.
What does it mean to say British culture,
Right.
Western culture? Is there even enough uniformity of value for that to be a meaningful phrase? And what is it that we should be worried about losing if that's diluted?
Yeah, that's a huge one. We're all trying to think about this at the moment. And there are versions of it that sound nicer than others. Some are horrific. We have this big discussion now, what is our culture, what is Britishness, and every country in Europe is having that discussion, and I hear it here, I hear it in Canada. Sort of constant self-examination. There's nothing wrong with that in a way, although it can cause what I regard as being a kind of breakdown. I mean, if you said to any individual all the time, who are you, what are you, you'd end up on the couch quite fast. And I think it might be the same for societies. If you just keep asking what you are rather than just getting on with it, you can kind of instigate an increased nervousness.
I think my instinct is to not care.
Right.
I'm happy to adopt whatever labels apply to me and to explain what those labels are, but there's nothing about me. This actually bothered my wife a little bit when I said so, because she cares a lot more about her heritage and her history and the people from
Right.
The Appalachian Mountain or the Smoky Mountains and things like that, and what those people have gone through. And I don't want to be just dismissive of history. But one of my ancestors was the preacher who was the founder of one of the first 3 Baptist churches that became the Southern Baptist Convention. And apart from it being novel, I don't care about that.
Right.
But there are also people in my past and cultural ties I could make that I would be that I don't view as negatives.
Right.
But they're not me.
No, but there's another French philosopher, Alain Finkielkraut, who recently said in an interview something I was very struck by. He said, we in France used to think that what we had was worth taking around and giving to the rest of the world. And then we retreated from that idea. And he said, now we're in a position of thinking, can we at least still have it for ourselves? And I was struck by that because, again, it might be a thing of, depending where you are and what you've seen, but given some of the things that France has gone through in recent years, some of which I write about in the book, multiple really terrible terrorist attacks and assassinations and so on, I can see why they are getting nervous and wanting to address some very fundamental principles. Is what we have in the secular French state, which allows for religion, but now is dealing with new problems, is it all vulnerable? And I know a lot of people who feel it is. And I suppose another thing, I spend a lot of my life as a journalist traveling, not just across this country and North America and across all of Europe, but the Middle East, the Far East, and Africa, and so on. And there is a definite feeling you get in certain places of, I don't want to enforce my own view of my own society on this, but this is very different, and it reminds you, therefore, that what you have is unusual. And I suppose that at different times, people become more aware of how, gotta be careful how you say this, but how lucky we may be in this country and in the country I'm from, for instance, that we're even within this discussion and freely able to have it and so on, and that some things down the road might stop that being the case. So I think that there are moments when societies become kind of febrile like that. Let me give an example. If any of you have ever been mugged or seen something terrible on the street,
We're in New York.
So it changes the way you look at people for quite some time afterwards, and maybe forever.
Yes.
If you've seen anything really brutal in the middle of a sophisticated, cultivated place, it will fundamentally change the way you look at everything afterwards and the way you look at people. And this is the case with conflict zones, war zones I've been in. It's not just that you come back from those places thinking, my God, I've got an idea of how lucky we are to have this settlement we have, but also why people who are from such places have put it this way, have one less layer of skin than everyone else and feel certain things early. And that's the case in certain countries in the West at the moment, and that's partly what this book is about, that certain countries, France being one, are really reevaluating some of this because they are seeing futures that they want to avoid.
I can see that. First of all, I recognize that there are people who are going to have experiences that are going to change the way they view things. That doesn't change whether or not their view is accurate.
Sure.
But when it comes to this idea that we need to protect our culture, whatever it is, from some other culture, that just doesn't seem to resonate with me for any reason, because maybe it's because I'm the standard generic privileged white American dude who doesn't care that much about his past, but I view things in terms of there are right answers and wrong answers to how to do things, and different views of what was right and wrong have existed in different cultures.
Sure.
But we know that some of them were wrong. I don't think either one of us is remotely a moral relativist.
Sure.
That is the thing that I want to hold to. What I view as the value of secular humanism, the value of basic freedoms. If I have a town and a bunch of people start moving to my town and they're bringing their cultural stuff, I don't have any fear that they're going to kill off my culture, because anything that's worth value to me, I'm going to protect anyway. And I advocate for the freedom for them to engage in and support and value their culture, right up to the extent that it impedes on the secular, reasonable, scientific founded laws and things like that.
It's like a boundary beating.
Yeah.
You've got to beat these boundaries quite hard, allow a lot to go on within it, but yes, and once certain lines are crossed, you've got to take a stronger view on it. That, by the way, I hark on about it, it may not be of much interest, but this is why France obsesses me, because within 1 year, they had the massacres at Charlie Hebdo, most satirical, secular atheist paper. They had the massacre of most of the staff of that magazine, and also a priest beheaded at the altar in Rouen as he was saying Mass. If that extremity of things can happen in a culture in quite a short space of time, that is the sort of thing that would return you to the fundamental questions. And as I say, one of the fundamental questions all the time is what we have the sort of natural default position of humankind, or is it a pretty unusual thing caused by quite unusual factors? And I, at any rate, take the second view, and therefore think that from the secular tradition and others, you've got to be aware of it, at the very least, to make sure you don't piss it away.
I think one of the things that this is another difference from two sides of the pond, and we talked about this very briefly, is that people will contact me on the show and say, "Oh, you spend all your time talking about Christianity. That's all you talk about, Christianity. Why would you do that?" Because it's a call-in show, and that's what people are calling in about. First of all, it's also my background. Well, you don't talk to us about Islam at all. And I was like, well, actually, we have many times, and there are occasionally Muslim callers. There's one of them who I'm fairly sure I made cry, even though that wasn't my intent. But we address those things, and yet the thing that I keep trying to point out to people is that while I might agree that when it comes to religions worldwide, Islam might be the single most dangerous ideas and be the greatest risk worldwide, but that doesn't mean it's the greatest risk in the United States or in Texas or in Austin.
Sure.
And you've spoken a great deal about Islam, and I think that there are different things going on in the UK that we don't see here. I mean, Muslims in the United States, I mean, apart from the general fear that has been instilled in everybody, which I think is at least exaggerated for us, but I couldn't say that for everybody. There are Muslims in Dearborn that are, drinking and getting tattoos, and they've been their version of Islam has been poisoned, probably for the good, by the secular and perhaps even Christian culture that they're surrounded by.
I once was with a pretty devout Muslim friend, and he'd been fasting for Ramadan, and he broke the fast with me in a pub with a pint of beer, which I thought was a happy meshing of cultures.
And so when we see these changes, and granted, I don't know, and you're free to tell us what we don't know about how things are much more in conflict with regard to people trying to impose their version of Sharia law in conflict with UK laws. And
there is some of that, and some of it's exaggerated, but a lot of it is real and is there. And I mean, I give the example of the de facto blasphemy law that now exists across Europe. I mean, it's not just Charlie Hebdo. Quite a number of colleagues and friends have been shot at in recent years for blaspheming Islam, and that's in 21st century Europe, and it's something which I, at any rate, and a number of other people refuse to shut up about, because we think it's intolerable that should be the situation. And the oddity of that is that, if there were to be anyone who decided to kill Michael Palin tomorrow because of the life of Brian, I strongly urge this is not something I think should happen.
Yes.
But if that were to happen, the whole culture, everything would turn on whoever did that. There would be no ifing and butting. There'd be no kind of, well, you've got to understand the offense he caused. We'd just be saying no. And that isn't the case with this other religion in this situation, partly because people are worried about allegations of bigotry, partly because they're worried that, it's kind of punching down, and one of the motifs of the time on this, and that you might be upsetting a beleaguered minority and so on. But a third of UK Muslims polled after the Charlie Hebdo attacks said that they had some sympathy with the attackers. A third. I happen to be gay, and I'm not delighted by some of the attitudes you can still hear from churches here about homosexuality, but in my own country, there was a poll in 2009 that found among British Muslims, 0% thought that you should be tolerant towards homosexuality. And a poll taken 2 years ago found that the majority of British Muslims wanted being gay to be made illegal now. So that's the sort of thing where you just start to worry. Okay, we've seen this off from one direction. What if it comes in another? And what if it benefits and gains from the fact that people are basically not primed to deal with it anymore?
There's a documentary on Netflix, because I watch tons of documentaries on Netflix, especially when I'm on the road, and it's called Welcome to Leith, and it is about a bunch of Nazis or neo-Nazis who moved to a town somewhere in, I don't know, Wyoming, Montana, someplace, and essentially tried to take it over.
Right.
And it's really eye-opening because it makes you wonder, well, what would happen if they tried to do this in my town? Now, it would take a lot of them to take over, Austin or New York or whatever, but in a small town, if you had a massive group of people show up with a particularly dangerous ideology, such that they could actually take over the city council, that they would become the dominant voting bloc.
Right.
What protections do you have?
Right.
In this case, I'm interested in, and we're looking at exploring this as a project. There are a number of towns that have been taken over by religious ideologies. There are towns that are almost exclusively Mormon or Hasidic Jew. And I have concerns about the constitutional rights of the individuals who live in those towns.
Sure.
Because in the states, the default is, oh, well, that, you really can't have any power, because we've got the Constitution and it's there to protect us. And as a reminder, you can in fact run for office anywhere in the United States if you're an atheist. Please stop spreading around that thing of my state constitution says you must believe. Yes, that was all settled by the Supreme Court in the 50s and then fought a couple other times as well. But you can run for office. But we had to fight it in court just to show what the Constitution says. And if they could take over a town, I get why people are terrified of that. Wouldn't it be a more practical solution? I don't know how this applies in the UK, but to just make sure that our laws are such that people can exercise their religious freedom, but they can't, there's the old joke about the Constitution, two wolves and a sheep are arguing over what's for dinner. And the Constitution, or the democracy, is what allows them all to vote, and the Constitution is what guarantees that the sheep's not going to be dinner. And it seems that we can enforce those ideas so that people can have their preferred culture, provided it can coexist with the surroundings.
Yeah, the moment that's what we're really struggling with across Europe at the moment, is to work out where the moments are where you tread over the rights of others in a way that's unacceptable, and also then what you do about it. Because this is, it's a dialogue of the demented at the moment, where the society says, there are some things we really strongly believe in, and if you don't believe in them, well, please do. It's not very assertively made. There's a sort of, well, what happens if I don't? Well, please do. There's no follow-up.
It starts to look like war and conflict and physical violence ends up being inevitable if you can't come to a reasonable...
Yes, and some people do fear that's the case. I don't take as apocalyptic a view as that, but there's a long way for this to run, and it doesn't all go in a good direction.
I know that I have probably 50,042 questions left for you, so we'll have to continue another time. But I've also noticed that it's been shockingly almost an hour, even though it feels like 20 minutes.
Can I ask a question of you?
You can.
You may. I spent, sorry to walk into your Q&A time, but I spent part of this morning watching your event with Jordan Peterson a couple of days ago. I'm doing some events with him in London coming up. And I was fascinated by it. and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about it that I might have missed. Has anyone here seen it? Well, probably quite a few people. Yeah, it's an amazing conversation, I think, and
I put out a video on my Atheist Debates channel, giving most of my thoughts to it. I am still confused and more than a little irritated.
Right.
Because I know that he had conversations with Sam Harris, and the first one was awful and painful because they couldn't come to some understanding about what truth was.
Yeah.
And for me, truth is that which comports with reality. Done. Or at least that's the truth I care about. Once we start talking about, oh, well, it's true for me, or it's true in a metaphorical sense, I realize that you can inspire people and even educate them with analogies and stories and things, but I care about whether something's really true. There's a gentleman that messaged me on Twitter, and he's written a big piece about this thing that I did with Jordan because he thinks I'm just monumentally wrong about what people actually believe about the existence of God. And he's like, most people, who believe that God exists don't actually believe that God exists. And I just think that's monumentally arrogant and dismissive. How dare you? I mean, there are probably people who have a metaphorical view of God that's fine for them, or that they believe in, but I know what I grew up with. I know what's popular and evangelical and fundamentalist. If you go up to them and say, you don't actually believe that there's a God, you'll find out fairly quickly that they are at least willing to defend the idea that they do.
They might even thump you for Jesus.
They might, yeah. Punch me in my fat face for Jesus. That was one of my favorite threats. But when I look back at the discussion, there were things that I loved about it in the sense that we were, it's frustrating to me that I can sometimes have conversations with people I disagree with much more easily than I can with, for example, some of my friends on the left who've decided that because I'm not willing to punch people for saying things that are awful, that I'm a Nazi sympathizer and will go out of their way to say this.
Right.
So it's frustrating because I disagree with, I don't think Jordan values skepticism. He kind of scoffed at it under his breath. And I wish I would have addressed that more. I think that's the biggest regret from the conversation that I have. But I was happy with that we didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about truth, except that it concerns me that with the fuzziness of how he talks about it, that maybe every single objection I had can be dismissed by saying, well, he didn't mean that true in reality. When he says, you can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, that atheists would actually be murderers.
The reference to crime and punishment.
Yes.
I thought that was very interesting,
I'm still not convinced of what he believes about the reality that we, as far as I can tell, share. But to say that Soviet Russia was a secular humanist...
I could see that was a bit that really got on your tits.
It did. Because you can say it's atheist, and I'll agree all day long. And it was all, you could also say that it was, you could try to make an argument that it was because of atheism, but you can't really get anywhere from atheism to, therefore, we should kill people and have this particular... You might as well start with his mustache and say, mustachioed dictators are awful.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, and it was really interesting, the points at which you really were clearly at loggerheads. One was that issue. A thought occurred to me, though, that Jordan clearly has a pretty bleak, you might say, realistic view of human nature and what it does when it's unleashed. And I share some of that. But it's possible that was one of the things that was playing out underneath that claim of his, which is... You sometimes see this, by the way, among very conservative people, that they come to quite rigid feelings about things because they actually themselves intuit where they might go unleashed. And that seemed to me to be sort of abundantly there in what he was saying. And I find his attitude towards religion fascinating. He reminds me of the philosopher Roger Scruton a bit, because the Scruton... I think he's written a lot about religion, but I think that if you really dug down and you said to him, for instance, do you believe in the physical resurrection? He would want to not answer that question.
And that's what
I
Jordan
think
does.
that's where Jordan is as well. And I'm not putting any views onto him that I think are dishonest, but I think that he has a real fear of saying something which he thinks would cause damage in a way if he did it.
Well, that's the one question that I asked him that I had prepared ahead of time based on what I knew, and that was, what is it that you fear we will lose if people give up a belief in a God? And he started with, well, we'll lose the narrative, the metaphorical substrate of the narrative, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't tell me anything, because it doesn't tell me what of the narrative is of value that we're losing.
Right.
And then when I pressed on that, he just said art, as if there's not... Well, the problem is that I could say there's tons of art from atheists, except that he also doesn't seem to think there are any atheists.
Right.
He thinks everyone is religious and that people are just professing atheism, but they've made... None of this meshes with... Certainly it reminds me when I'm in debates with Christian apologists and they say, oh, you're not really an atheist, you actually are just publicly denying that you exist, you believe in a God. Or you actually know that a God exists. And that comes from, I did a debate with Saiten Bruggencate, who's a presuppositionalist, and that's his big thing. We all know that God exists, including you. You're just lying or whatever. And he's mocked for it. And yet in reality, Jordan did exactly the same thing, essentially saying, all you atheists are professing atheists, that a real atheist would be a cold-blooded killer who would rationalize and justify this way. You can't have a moral foundation that is secular. And he tried to use AI. Anyway, I don't want to go through the whole evening, but it was essentially the same thing I get from unschooled, uneducated apologists on behalf of a much more strict view of religion. And that's why earlier, you may be right about what he's afraid of, and I tried to get to what he's afraid of. But when you were talking about suggesting that we may have lost something and encouraging people to go back to church for that, I didn't know how similar those things were. I think there's a difference.
I'm slightly towards his direction. Some of that. I don't want to belabor this, but just one example. A little while ago, after a talk, a young man, a student, came over to ask a question afterwards, and he said, this was a real warning flash, you'll know this. He said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials.
Because you're Douglas Murray and not Charles Murray?
Yes, exactly. And there's no relation. But he said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials. An interesting subject that it might be. It's not a specialism of mine, and so on. But it's also something more than that. And you often find this in conversations with people. You unearth something you thought or were worried about, which you just hadn't found the right way of addressing. And I was sort of trying to dodge this young guy, because to me it's a little bit like somebody coming over to me and saying, why don't you ever talk about the Jews? You sort of moving swiftly on, but this young man who said this to me, I was sort of struck. He kept pushing at this, and I realized that I had a number of reasons for wanting to dodge this, and not just it wasn't my specialism, but I ended up saying to him that, look, you may want to keep delving into that and so on, but I said, first of all, I'm just not sure what you can do about that. And secondly, I said to him, I finally realized what it was. I said, I just would feel nervous about a future in which people were really interested in IQ difference, and where we lost a sense of, in a religious or atheistic sense, the sanctity of the individual. And it clarified for me that sometimes you see how a pile-up can happen, and you didn't realize that was why you didn't want anything to do with it. But that was the case with this young man, I'm sure.
There's people who press on a number of issues. I'm exactly with you. One of the reasons that I'm advocating so much in this year and more than the past, I'm an atheist, but I'm also a secular humanist, and I also value human life and human dignity. And as somebody who was given IQ tests as a kid and had specific things done to me as a result of those scores, I know people with IQs higher than mine who are boneheadedly stupid, and people who have incredibly low IQs who are brilliant at things. And I care more about what people believe, because the beliefs inform the actions, and mostly I care about whether or not those beliefs are reasonable. Because I want to make sure that, I've said I want to believe as many true things, as few false things as possible. That's me cribbing Hume in a more hip fashion. But it's true, and you have to have both parts of that. And it seems to me that anytime we start trying to quantify the value of people, doing math with souls, doing the collateral damage math, doing the what's your IQ, how many Twitter followers do you have, all of these things distract from whether or not what this person has said is reasonable and accurate.
And you always get to that position that any avid reader will always be confronted by at some point, which is that somebody you know who's never read a book can be the loveliest person you know.
That's not a discouragement from reading, by the way.
No. Or indeed buying books.
Especially as we have the strange death of Europe. On that note, I want to we're going to go ahead and move on to some questions from you guys, because you guys may have way better questions than I was going to come up with at all. But thank you so much for doing this, and we'll get some questions here from folks. There are microphones up at either one of these. And I think they'll bring, I don't know what the lighting change is going to be, but you can come up to the mics. A couple of reminders. After we're done with the Q&A, Douglas will be out to sign books, and I'll be out to shake hands because I don't have a book to sign yet. But also, questions end in a question mark, and they don't begin with your life story or your dissertation. Those who are familiar with me from the atheist experience know that I will hang up on people, and if you think I can't do it live from the stage, you are mistaken. But we'll start here with you, sir, if you can. You don't have to say your name, but who the question's for, or both, or whatever.
My name is Alex. Question is open to both, but somewhat more focused to Mr. Murray. In your book, you refer a lot to the dichotomy of identities between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. My family is from Eastern Europe, from Romania, where we have a very deep relationship to perhaps not being particularly observant in religion, but being Eastern Orthodox. Many of our saints fall into very much this idea of protecting Europe from the Ottoman attack, for which we, for hundreds of years, were both subject to, 500 years, and fought against. And it's this new type of narrative that we do speak about. I'd like to get some more impressions on not only how you see that as a potential solution. You speak specifically about Slovakia and Poland, I reckon. Poland is doing a little bit different thing right now at the moment with their history. But if you see a solution in this sort of not necessarily virulent nationalism that we experience in the 90s in places like Yugoslavia, but rather, do you see as a corrective model in Western European identities by saying, as you say, sort of revisit the paths that you've developed from potentially in a church?
That's a very interesting question. Basically, for this book, I as well as traveling for some years to a lot of the countries that people have been fleeing from, both as asylum seekers and as economic migrants, I'd also spent recent years traveling across the continent from north to south, east to west, meeting a lot of migrants, for instance, who just come off the boats, the Greek and Italian islands, speaking to a lot of refugees, migrants, and so on, and following the conversations all the way up to the chancelleries of Europe. And yes, you're right. I came to the decision that the recognition fairly early on that there was a totally different view in the former Eastern European countries and the Western European countries. And look, this could all get very messy. I have no doubt about that, and I'm aware of what in some of these countries not very distant history has been, and we're always walking on precipices of some kind. My view is that the reason why they have a totally different view towards mass migration and other related issues is because not only they had a history for hundreds of years fighting with the Ottoman Empire, pushing them back from the gates of Vienna and much more. But because of what I think of as the 20th century issue, I mean, we in Britain, like you in America, we never had the Nazis in our country. They made it to the Channel Islands in the UK, but we didn't see populations rounded up and sent to the death camps. And
You did see a lot of bombs, though.
we saw a lot of bombs, it's true.